Hello there, and I'm live. We're going to talk a bit about the Premier League this evening. The Premier League starts on Friday night. Newcastle are in action on Saturday, as we're aware. I was waiting for a few people to join, but looks like we're ready to talk about the Premier League. We're ready to go with Newcastle United in the Premier League this season. Looks like transfers as well are all up in the air, and Mark Gahey, the situation there. We'll just wait for a few people to join, and we'll get going. But so far in terms of transfers and the situation where we are, Mark Gahey, the bid was rejected by Steve Parish, as we know, his interviews with Sky and Talksport and all that sort of thing. We're going to be talking a little bit about, as I say, the Premier League start and where we think Newcastle are going to finish. Drop some comments in the chat so we can so we're aware of, so we can get chatting and we can get talking. And yeah, we'll take it from there. But just wait for a few more people to join before we really get going. If you haven't already seen it, I did a channel update this morning explaining the look of how it's going to be at least the start of the season. Still trying to figure out how things work because in terms of coverage in Newcastle, I'm not actually going to be at St James's Park all that too much this season. I'm going to be various different places, different matches, different games, and all that sort of thing. So in terms of match day coverage of St James's Park, it's not going to be a common theme, but the channel is going to be very, very much Newcastle United centric, especially with these lives and these live reviews of games and stuff. I did also say that it would be in a couple of weeks' time that would happen because I'm going to the Paralympics to cover those games in a week on Friday. So I'll be gone for a couple of weeks. There won't be too much from this channel, certainly not planned. I might be able to do a couple of videos if that comes around. But yeah, do check out the channel update video from earlier to understand what the season's going to look like. The channel's going to look like at the start of the season. So yeah, how will Newcastle United do this season? What will this season look like for Newcastle United? As I say, drop some thoughts in the chat below to see to let me know what you think, and we'll and the reasons I'm sort of doing this is I like doing this is to bounce off you guys and sort of see what you guys think as well and interact with you rather than just sort of giving my thoughts. So drop some thoughts in the comments and we'll get going. But for me, I think there's been a lot of negativity around Newcastle. I also wrote an article on how Newcastle's pre-season looked for the BBC Sport website last week, or it came out this week, sorry. And actually, I think that despite all of the negativity that we've covered on the channel throughout the summer in terms of Eddie Howe and Amanda Staveley going and all that sort of thing, Newcastle actually, and the fact obviously there's no transfers as well, but I think Newcastle have weathered a bit of a storm and they're coming through and they actually start this season with a fair bit of momentum. They look good in pre-season. Players are fit. They've got strength and depth again, and they should beat Southampton on Saturday, regardless of whether they have any new signings through the door. So I'm quite confident of a decent start. Let me know, as I say, in the comments what you think. But I think Newcastle will do quite well this season. I think there's lots of sort of hyperbole from outside in terms of where Newcastle will finish, in terms of lots of people saying I've seen today on sort of mid-table and not back in to qualify for Europe. I think Europe has got to be the push this season, as I mentioned on a lot of videos in the past. This has got to be a season where the pressure's sort of on a little bit in a way it hasn't been in previous seasons, in terms of board expectation, but also there's nothing really in the way. There's no relegation, which is what threatened them in the first half season that they were at the club and the takeover and Eddie Howe and everything. Then that season that they came in and it was a bit of a free hit the first full season. Let's see what they can do. They overachieved. Last season was a bit of a difficult one in terms of getting injuries and fitness and having no real ability to play to their strengths and play the way they wanted to. That's not really the case now. They're ultimately in a position where they can thrive, and I think even without signings, they're in a position where they can have a good season. And there's a lot of debate, and again, get some thoughts in the comments with your suggestions. But for me, the situation is that European football's got to be the aim, and I think that the board will expect that but at the same time, if there aren't any signings, as the first comments come through, so if we don't address the two positions that need addressing, we'll finish top 7. If we address them, we'll finish top 5. That's a really good. I think that's a really fair assessment, and I think this is quite pertinent. If the board expects, possibly even top 4, top 5, certainly, but possibly even Champions League football next season, in terms of that's what needs to happen to almost be in the best position to keep the likes of Bruno, Isak, and Gordon, and stop the club from regressing quite badly next season. They need to strengthen. They need to add players. Eddie Howe would be very much in his within his rights to turn around and say, "Well, you haven't given me the best tools to do my job. I haven't got the strength in the defence. I haven't got the strength at right midfield." So, absolutely think that Newcastle are that's absolutely fair. That's a really good point that's been made, that it comes down to transfers, and I understand the fretting. I understand the thing, and I think things are ramping up. I was at the Cellar Cup, obviously, last week. If you haven't checked out that video, do go and do that now, or after this live stream. It was great to be there and speak to Eddie Howe. I spoke to him at Hull City as well. So I've spoken to people around the club this summer, and there's not too much panic, at least externally, at least the way that they're sort of putting across to the media, to the likes of myself and other journalists, that there's not a great deal of panic at the moment, and they're aware that things can pick up, but it is a little bit concerning that they haven't signed any players, and I can understand from a fan perspective that is difficult, but at the same time, the squad is also strong. It's in a good place in terms of players coming back, and the likes of Tonali returning in at the end of August, and Willock being fit again, hopefully for a long period of time. Joe Linton being fit again for a period of time. Isak, if he can stay fit, then Newcastle have a world-class striker up front. That puts a lot of pressure on, even without transfers, this sort of thing. But I think, as I say, it's not just where Newcastle finish in terms of, for the board's perspective and for the fans, and for Eddie Howe. I think it's also in terms of the likes of Isak and Bruno and Gordon, and those players who have been linked with moves away, who Newcastle look set to keep this summer. But if they're not in the Champions League, and possibly certainly not in Europe, but definitely, if they're not in the Champions League, there's going to be a possibility that people start to get a bit concerned, that those players get a bit concerned about their futures at Newcastle. So I do feel like even without transfers, there's got to be a high level of expectation on the team. As I do say that, I admit. And I think Eddie Howe's in a fair position to say, if I don't get those two players that I need in right winger and centre back, and they're going big for the centre back at the moment, as we know, then we'll what do you expect me to do? I'm not a negative person. I don't judge window until it's ends. My personal opinion. Honestly believe that there won't be any players in. Just got a feeling. See, I personally disagree with that. I understand, again, I get the feeling, I get the negativity, and I get the sort of the sense of that. But I think you can question maybe some of the things. Personally, I've said about Mark Gahey, it's a bit strange to me that they're going so big on a centre back. That Palace obviously aren't in a mood to sell for cheap, and they're really pushing that. When they have another position, they have a defender in Malik Thiaw who they've talked about getting a decent fee for in about £35 million, and then you can go and put some effort into strengthening at right midfield. Obviously, Noni Madueke is a deal that could be done there. But for me, I think that there's going to be players coming in. I understand, again, that the feeling. I get the fret about it, but for me, I still think Newcastle are in a strong position for signing. They've got a lot of money in the bank to spend on one or two players. You can argue, you can make different arguments about where they are in terms of in terms of that, how well they're distributing that money, and if it's right that they go and spend 70 million, possibly 65, 70 million on a centre back rather than splitting it 50-50 between that and a right winger. But that's a different argument, I think, in terms of getting a player, and I think they will get a player, and it would be interesting to see if Mark Gahey, if they go in for another bid for Gahey. But yeah, let me know if you're in the chat what you guys think about this season. How confident are you about beating Southampton? How confident are you about, with Sandro Tonali coming back for Spurs? That'll be huge. And what would be success and what would be failure for you this season? What do you think about that in terms of, where do you see the line in terms of that? And does, as the comments have been suggesting so far, the lack of transfer activity give you a bit more leeway towards Eddie Howe? Because from my perspective and from what I've seen, a lot of people are saying things about Eddie Howe that they weren't saying last season. There isn't that sort of, like, I think at a point at Christmas when there was a real pressure on him, and there was people started to talk a little bit about his future. A lot of fans jumped to his defense. Immediately and said that he shouldn't be under pressure. I don't get that feeling now. I feel like now, as I said, I alluded to earlier, there's a perspective on this, but it's a bit like the club is in a place where they need to deliver, and Eddie Howe needs to deliver, but at the same time, obviously no transfers. Does that change your opinion of that? Let me know in the comments. Hi Johnny, hope you're well. Johnny says Southampton should be a handsome win, major panic. If not, I can understand that. I can absolutely understand that that thought process, and I believe that Newcastle will win that game fairly comfortably. They looked really, really good. I know it's only a friendly, and you can't take too much into it, but their friendly progression has, even though they lost in Japan, has been really good. They were sort of very solid against Hull, really, really good in that first half against Girona, and good in the first half against Brest as well. The second halves were a bit sort of useless in terms of getting any information from them. But for me, that they look in good shape, and I understand. Sorry, did I say major panic? Sorry, it's mild panic from Johnny. Yes, absolutely. I think that will probably set in, especially because Newcastle do need to. I think there is a bit of pressure on Newcastle to start fast this season, because their fixture list, at least early on, is quite generous up until, really, I think it gets difficult when it's at Christmas time. But yeah, we're in a position, I think, Newcastle, where they have to deliver from the very start. So I think there would be a little bit of the narrative would quickly change if they didn't beat Southampton, because I think a lot of people are sitting where I am, where they're kind of in the boat that, yeah, but Southampton are beatable as it is, and if they're not, if they don't get beaten, then the questions start to be asked. William Kane says success is success. Win anything below fourth is a failure. See, I think that that is a very fair assessment for this season, the way the owners view it, at least bringing Paul Mitchell in. But at the same time, they do have to deliver signings, because otherwise, do Newcastle have the fourth best squad in squad? I think first 11. I absolutely think that they are in the top four. But squad, do they have the fourth best squad in the league to get in that or a squad capable of getting in that top four? Yes, they haven't got injured. They haven't got Europe, and other teams do. But do they have the squad? If Isak gets injured, is Asula or Wilson ready to step up, and do you trust them? Is that midfield? Newcastle have lost a key player in the strength of that squad in terms of Elliot Anderson. So does that impact? But I do get the sentiment. I agree with that. I think the club are looking for Champions League football this season. I think you are looking at a very different club next summer if they're not in the Champions League. I think Europe is one thing, but Bruno, Isak, Gordon could all look and say, well, I've given this club 3 years now, and they're not progressing past that first season when we got in the Champions League. There's not anything more. There needs to be, I think, a big statement to keep those players, and that's either Champions League or possibly a cup win. And I think we're at that stage now where Newcastle need to deliver something like that now. To answer Johnny's point, why is there no one else in for Gahey? I don't know the answer to that. Obviously, there's a lot of interest, but I think Crystal Palace are really keen on I think Steve Parish coming out and saying what he said. I think they're really, really keen on a bidding war that's just not coming at the moment, not happening. And I think that maybe it's because the price is already set too high, and there aren't many. Man United were one of those clubs credited with an interest, and they've gone and got Delict, they've gone elsewhere, they've looked at Branthwaite as well, and they balked at the price for Branthwaite, and that's kind of similar for Gahey as well. So that rules Man United out. Liverpool, another club interested, but again, I think they've got their own financial situation where they don't, at least either don't want to or can't go big on too many players. They've made their play for a number 6. Obviously, with Zubimendi rejecting that move, that's going to be interesting. But I think that's kind of why this is that Gahey. I think that Newcastle were the first to make a play, and they made a big play. They, as an opening bid, to talk around 45. I think it was 40 plus 5. So when there are other clubs who have other targets, I think maybe they haven't just joined the thing. But I also think that that's a positive thing for Newcastle in the sense that I think Palace are really keen on a bidding war. If you listen to what Steve Parish has said, he's really sort of trying to ramp it up, and sort of he's not mentioning Newcastle in name. He's talking about nobody has, and until somebody, and he wants, I think, somebody else to put pressure on and see if someone else will go out and get and pay that much. And I think Palace are in a position where they kind of either have to sell him now or look elsewhere for something else. So yeah, I think that's how I see it anyway. The Gahey situation. Daniel says, if this transfer window ends as things stand now, will the responsibility stand on Mitchell, or will he be given a pass by Piff? I think it would be really harsh to blame Mitchell for this in the first season when there's been PSR nightmare that happened before he arrived that they're trying to tread along, because obviously, yes, the PSR situation is better, but it's not. They really want to avoid getting anywhere near that for a long time, and that means that they can't go out and go huge. So this being Paul Mitchell's first season in charge, I think it would be really difficult to blame him for that. Demanding top 4 is a bit much, says Jay. We were relegation fodder one season. Next season, massively overperformed. Last season, excelled until Pope got injured. Top 6 is a respectable. I don't disagree with that at all, really, Jay. But at the same time, I just think that, and again, whether it's harsh or not, I think it would be incredibly harsh to demand something like a top 4 finish without any signings. But I think that's where PIF are. I think that they are everything. It's a bit of an oxymoron in this summer, in that they have made big plays. I think with the moving out of with Staveley going and then Paul Mitchell coming in, and sort of this reshuffle, and they've looked really ruthless. But that they also need to sign players. This is a question directly for Jay, and he might have answered this in a point later. But Jay, do you think, as a response to that, if Newcastle were to sign Gahey and Madueke, for example, that the top 4 would be doable? Is there a way that you think top 4 this summer realistically can become a genuine target with the constraints that Newcastle have in the market? Daniel says, we don't have to go huge, but we need to be improving the first team as things stand. I think we've regressed. West Ham will probably finish above us. See, I think West Ham's window's been good, but I still think it's not been on a level with what to catch Newcastle. I think the way I would characterise it is that they've signed a lot of players who are good players. Kilman and Somerville, Fulkrug, and the like. But again, I don't think any of those players, a little bit like Villa, what I said about Villa in a previous live stream, I don't think any of those players really sort of touch the sides for Newcastle. Even maybe Somerville because of the winger situation, but Fulkrug isn't getting above Isak. Kilman isn't getting in above again, if everyone's fit, either Share or Botman, in my opinion. Newcastle have bigger targets, and they spent 80 million on those players. And I think that Newcastle are a better team than West Ham. But the way I would characterise it is that the reason why I'm still so confident about the season is because Liverpool, Arsenal, and Manchester City all their fans are desperate for them to sign. They're the three best teams in the country, and they're desperate for them to sign Gordon, Bruno, and Isak. And Villa don't have a player like that those clubs are desperate for. I don't think that West Ham do. I don't think Manchester United have a player that, in an attacking sense, that those clubs would be desperate for. So I think Newcastle's actual first 11 is strong enough to get in the top 4. As I said earlier, my question is whether it's strong enough to reach the if there's an injury or something like that. Jay's answer to the question: not at all. If we had a top 4 wage bill and transfer budget, then expectations should follow. I think the club understands what's realistic. Yeah, potentially, but at the same time, I would say that there's an element of, as I said earlier, the pressure that Bruno and Gordon and Isak will put on the club. I think to get in the Champions League. Or do you just accept that maybe that first phase means that having to get rid of at least 1 or 2 of those players and restarting and going again in a world where, because if you think about it, if Newcastle were to sell one of those, they would solve their PSR issues for a few years, but they'd also have more money coming in from Adidas and sponsorships. We are talking about transfers. I'm trying to talk about the season generally in a second, but just to answer this point, even if you sell one of those players and the next phase is to maybe regress to progress in that sense, is that something that's going to happen? And would you accept that? But for me, I think that Newcastle need to keep those players, and to keep those players, I think that they're probably. I imagine that they'll be wanting the Champions League this season. But I do take on the point that Newcastle maybe don't have the capabilities at this stage to, in terms of wage structure and money to go and get that. Cloud says, stupid question, but do you think the club believe that they can get top 5 with the squad they have and then spend big next summer? I don't think that's the case, because, and if it is, it's a very silly thing to think, because the Premier League is so competitive. Other clubs are, as much as other clubs, as much as I said, Newcastle are in a decent position with their first team. You can't rest on your laurels, and they're not resting from a very strong position in terms of league position and that sort of thing. So, I think they are trying. I think they are. I think they know that they don't need too much. I think they would love a second centre half on the level of Botman. And I think that's what they're viewing Gahey to really transform that defence, and another right winger. But actually, Newcastle scored loads of goals last season, so an output from another attacking output, maybe from statistically, isn't as important as a big name centre half. And I think that's maybe why they're going for the centre back. Maybe, I don't know, especially given that Botman and Lascelles are both out with cruciate injuries, so they're out for a long time. At the moment, I think long term, absolutely, the right winger thing is more important. But at the moment, I think you can actually understand, if you think about it in those terms, why the centre back is a bigger thing. I think the season we get top 4. I think the season we got top 4 was an anomaly combination of a feel good factor, Howe's impact, and other teams not knowing what to expect from us. It will take time. I'm just happy to not be relegation. I think that's a really fair point. Yeah, thanks, Johnny. Please do like and share and subscribe to everything. Cheers for tuning in. I think for me, yeah, I can understand why the top 4 situation is where it is but I just think it would be different if Newcastle had already signed a centre half, because the assumption is, and it's a fair assumption, that their squad is not going to struggle as much. They're going to have a game every 7 days, not a game every 3 days, and that is and they also haven't been to America and travelled across America and tired themselves out before in that summer series. I don't think that helped. Japan was a fair amount of traveling, but they didn't have to go across Japan, and they sort of they came back sort of well rested, and then they've domestically they've done quite a bit. They obviously went to Germany as well, so I think in that sense that's going to help. And I do think that the team, because I think if you've got a team with Bruno, Isak, Gordon, Tonali when he gets better, Joe Linton, Willock, Botman when he comes back, I think that is a top 4 team. I understand Jay's perspective, and I understand absolutely it's great to be not feeling sick about relegation every season, but I do think that there's got to be an aim for the Champions League if they want to progress in this cycle. Obviously, it could be, as I alluded to, another cycle comes in and they have to go again. That could absolutely be the case, but it'll take a bit of time. And I think especially if you sell Isak or Bruno or Gordon, the chances are they go to another Premier League rival, which adds to the gap. So I think that Newcastle are in a bit of a sticky situation this summer, in that sense. Daniel says any hype around the project with disseminated, and if we don't get Champions League this season, if we don't get Champions League or win a cup this season, that's what I mean. I think to keep the momentum of this, I think there was an acceptance of to why there was a stumbling block last season. They because they, as was rightly pointed out, they pushed up too high and got a lot further than they thought they would in that first full season, getting Champions League. That came too soon for them to be ready for it, if you like. So last season they struggled to adapt, but they've kept those players. Villa have got Champions League and they've had to sell one, and they've also sold another of their key players. And as underwhelming as Diaby may have been last season, they haven't replaced him with a player who looks capable of bettering what he did. He scored 14 goal contributions in the Premier League last season, which was underwhelming. But I don't think there's any player that they've brought in that looks like they can shoulder that responsibility and help Watkins. Newcastle are not in Europe, and they've kept Bruno, Isak, and Gordon to this point. I think they will keep them all for next season. And I think if they stay fit, Newcastle are in a position where they have to look at the Champions League. Trophy is more important to me personally, says Jay, than the Champions League. It was fun, but also robbery in parts. Yeah, and was sick and blatantly dodgy at UEFA, and even pulled the ref for the next game. That was the Livramento handball. I was sat in the press box in Paris, and it was quite a bizarre feeling. Do you mean Gahey, Klaus? It's interesting that there's no reports that the deal is off. Because assuming you mean Gahey, do you think we'll get Gahey? Yes, I think. Sorry, I didn't read your comment above. Yes, I do think we'll get Gahey. If Newcastle go in again, I think they'll get him. I think this is posturing from Palace and posturing from Steve Parish. I think it's really, really telling that he's gone live with it, because I think Gahey has made his point about wanting to leave. That wasn't denied by Parish, who said that he is professional, and he made a point of saying that his agents were good people. So the idea that it's been done amicably, but he isn't just sitting there not wanting the move. I think he is really keen to make this move, and I think ultimately that might swing it. If Newcastle do, I think the next bit of pressure will be enough if they want it. If they don't, then they have to have some other idea to back it up, and that might be Noni Madueke as a might be splitting the money, going for Teao and going for Noni Madueke and getting that player in, or it might be something else. I don't know, but they have to have some sort of plan. To Jay's point, I can understand why a trophy is more important. I think that is a monkey that Newcastle do need to get off their back quite quickly, because that is also, Newcastle played in the Champions League in previous eras under Sir Bobby and under Kenny Dalglish. They need to be in a position. They've never done is won a trophy in the modern era, and I think that is something that, even if it's the Carabao Cup, if it's the FA Cup, it makes everything. That I think that's a reason why that would be a justification maybe for why for Bruno staying or Gordon staying and progress and proof of progress with the project. But at the same time, if Man City come in for Bruno next summer, if they or even this summer, it could be difficult to turn down. This summer's difficult for him to go now because I think he's made such a big deal about wanting to stay that I think it would be. I think, and as I said in a previous video, I think Man City have said off the record that they're waiting for Bruno to make a move that he just isn't making this summer. But again, depending on what happens this season, that could be reevaluated next year. City do obviously have a bit of money to spend this summer now. Julian Alvarez is gone, but I think for me, what do you think about players? Who do you think which players are gonna stand out this season? Who are the players that you're looking forward to seeing? Chris says it's the age-old thing, isn't it? Chris says surely the Champions League opens more financial doors. It's that age-old thing, isn't it? If you want to be this is why Arsenal were always ready for something. They botched it a little bit in the years after Wenger, but this is why Wenger's greatest achievement for me was actually not the Invincibles. It was keeping them when they were paying off the Emirates, keeping them in the top four, because it always meant that they were never in any. That they always had the money to go big when they wanted to, and that's why they went and got Ozil and Sanchez, and then it was a choice that Wenger made not to, and he's probably stayed a little bit too long, but he kept them in a position where they could compete because exactly what Chris has just said. But I also think a trophy gets the monkey off the back, doesn't it? It's amazing to think that they were one game away 2 seasons ago from having both, and if they just sort of get the nerve a little bit and maybe played the game more than the occasion, and they had a little bit more luck at Wembley, then they could have had both, and we could be sitting in a situation where the trophy monkey that I mentioned has already been knocked off the back. So which players do you think this season are going to be key for Newcastle, assuming that they all stay? Gordon, for me, Gordon was the player of the season last year, and I think he could be again massive. Bruno, obviously, they can't. The team doesn't function without him, and that's why I think if they lose Bruno now, between now and the end of the season, it could be massive, a massive blow. But obviously, will Isak win the Golden Boot? And is that a legitimate question to ask, or is it just another year where Haaland gets a third in a row? But I think Isak is in a position where Newcastle. That's why I think Newcastle have a great chance of getting Europe, because they've got Isak up front who could easily score 25, 30 in the Premier League if he stays fit. So I think that's going to be an interesting race between him and Haaland. I don't buy this idea that Ollie Watkins is in that race because he played 7 more games than Isak last season and scored 2 fewer goals. Hardy Dave says Barnes and Tonali. Can Tonali play 6, allowing for Bruno to get forward more? So that was the original plan, was to have the pair of them sort of rotating, and the midfield was supposed to be a lot more fluid than it ever had been. It was allowed to get because Tonali wasn't there, obviously. Longstaff has his limitations, but what Longstaff is good at, Tonali is also good at. So theoretically, that can work. I think that's where the midfield comes up. Barnes is going to have a massive season. The other thing that people aren't talking about, and this is what I've said on the True Faith podcast before, and it's not an ideal situation, but if Newcastle can't get a right winger in, then I think theoretically you could play Gordon, who's played on the right and maybe had slightly like an 80% or 85% of his impact on the right, and have Barnes on the left, and that would surely strengthen and be a stronger lineup than Murphy and Almiron with Gordon on the left, surely. But I think that's going to be interesting. Jay says Isak needs to develop his aerial ability to hold up play. He's magic, but can be anonymous on occasion. Yeah, that's a very interesting point. We did a podcast on True Faith about Isak, and one of the questions about his weaknesses, and that was the point that people made, was that he isn't strong enough, and I think that's ultimately that's unfortunately just not part of his game. But I do take the point that there just isn't enough physicality, and that as a result, if Newcastle don't have a foothold in the game, he isn't going to change that. And I think that maybe that's something that Will Asula can develop, and that's certainly something that I think Wilson's had. Wilson's quite good at actually, he tends to be better at holding the ball than than Isak is. So, but I agree wholeheartedly with everything that Jay said about the weakness that Isak does have is that he is his physical ability, and maybe that's something that can change. He's also said, I want to see a relationship form between the central three. It never clicked before Tonali's ban. That was a really good point. I think it did click before Tonali's ban, or it clicked with Longstaff. It certainly clicked between Bruno and Tonali in the PSG game and West Ham in the first half, where they actually started to play really well. There was obviously that fabled Brighton game when the three of them played, the three that everyone's desperate to see, Joelinton, Tonali, and Bruno played together, and they were absolutely bossed by Brighton. I think there is a little bit of development, but there has to be that faster development. It has to sort of hit the ground running. The good thing about Tonali is that last season there was lots of learning to adjust to Newcastle and learning to adjust to life in England, to speaking English. His English is phenomenal now. He's settled off the pitch. That means he can hopefully settle on the pitch very, very quickly. Does Anthony Gordon play more on the right if the right winger is not signed? That's exactly that's a hypothesis that I have that I would certainly look into. I don't know about you guys, but for me, if no right wing is signed, would you not sacrifice to get the best out a better player than Almiron and Murphy generally in Barnes onto the pitch? Would you sacrifice maybe a little bit of Gordon's game? But Gordon's played on the right for Newcastle, and I think he's done a very, very good job. And actually, I've not really seen much difference when he's played on the right to when he's played on the left in terms of his output. But let me know what you think, because I think that's a very, very good point that should be considered at the very least. Again, let me know. Is Barnes a 38 million bench player? It is a bit odd, but I think again, I think Barnes is the best example of them last season, and this is why the right midfielder thing is so pertinent now. It's because it's the only position that's not been strengthened since the takeover happened, and they opted against it last season to get Barnes, because Barnes was an opportunistic signing, and that's now ramped the pressure up. I wonder if Barnes being injured last season would have changed anything. But again, ultimately, if you want to get the best out of both Gordon and Barnes, that's not possible because they both play on the left. And there is a question probably to be asked there. Is it right that Barnes is a 30 million? Sorry, just Jay says a 38 million pound bench player. Can I see Sanusi getting more minutes? Absolutely, Chris, I can. Sanusi has been somebody who, there was a little bit of noise about him when he first emerged. This summer's been a bit of a transformation in terms of the way he's been viewed by the press pack at Newcastle and viewed maybe by the fans as an extension of that. The way he made an impact against Girona, and I think Eddie Howe was asked about him after the Girona game, and I think he's also been asked about him during the tour of Japan, and he was complimentary. He said he needs to learn a little bit, but I think for raw ability, that just fearlessness, but also the ability to it's one thing to be prepared to run at people, but to actually to get the ball past them as often as he was doing in that second half against Girona, in particular, the link up with Isak. There was a little bit of tactical naivety, I think. There was a point where he switched. So Isak, as we know, he loves to drift out to the left, and that means that the left winger goes central. And that happened in the first half. And when it's happened with Gordon knows to make the runs forward as a centre forward, as a number 9. He doesn't do it. He knows how to do it. He doesn't like to do it as a player. It's not where he's strongest, but he knows how to do it. There was a point where Isak made a run down the left, and Sanusi followed him onto the left and got in his way. And I think that summed up the sort of tactical development that Eddie Howe said that Sanusi needs to go on. But you've got to remember, he's 17 at that stage, just playing regular minutes and having fun and taking players on and training with better players. That's how I've mentioned this about Louis Miley, but that's how Pep Guardiola got the best out of Phil Foden, was he just kept him around the place, training with the likes of De Bruyne, learning from them. And it was really interesting that this season, this summer, at the Cellar Cup, Eddie Howe was asked about three players at three different times, will you send them out on loan? First one was Sanusi. He said no, unequivocally. Second one was Ben Parkinson. And the third one was Jamie Miley. And he sort of said it will be an individual basis. And he didn't rule it out with Miley or Parkinson, whereas he absolutely said no, Trevor Sanusi will stay and learn. I don't think he'll be a regular player. I think it's a little bit different. Obviously, if there's a winger crisis on the level that there was last season, you might see him. But I think I'm not quite sure he's as developed and ready as Miley is for first team football. I think Louis Miley is a little bit of a freak in that sense. He's a lot further on than lots of people have thought he was. But yeah, for me, we're in a position, Newcastle are in a position where they can play Trevor Sanusi quite a bit this season. But I think you'll find cup games maybe off the bench and maybe 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there, rather than what ended up being a sort of breakout season for Louis Miley. I don't think that'll happen, but I don't think he's going out on loan, so he could certainly be in for a good season. Jay says Murphy's looking great. His attitude is invaluable. Surprised he wasn't mentioned for a role in the leadership group. I think the leadership group came down to Bruno in the end. I would have said, I spoke to Nick Pope over the summer, and I'd have said he would have been ideal. But it's a really good point. He's Murphy is the most underrated. I wouldn't say he's the most underrated player in the squad in terms of his ability, but he's certainly the most underrated player in terms of, for me, his personality and what he brings off the pitch. And I know that gets mocked a lot, but lots of people talk about squads and building squads as if it's FIFA or Football Manager. You need the best players. You need players who are elite at every, 2 elite players, and you need to be able to be at that level. If one player, so you avoid a drop off if one player gets injured. And I fully understand that, but at the same time, it's great to have players who accept their role and put the team first and are happy to play a bit part role as long as they're involved. And Murphy epitomizes that perfectly. And actually, a lot like Almiron, I know a lot of people sort of, with Almiron, it gets forgotten for me. But a lot of people, they say that Almiron's terrible. The pair of them have really, really developed under Eddie Howe. They've got structure in their game. It was a difficult season for Almiron last season, but at the same time, I would never call the year before a complete fluke. He was growing up to that before in the second half of that season under Eddie Howe. The goal he scored against Palace, for example, in that first season, there was a goal he scored against Everton, I think, that same season as well. So he was showing signs of that, and Murphy's very much the same in that he's developed and become a Premier League quality winger. When there was a point where he couldn't get on the bench for championship teams under Steve Bruce, and he was loaned out and just completely disregarded. I think Eddie Howe deserves a lot of credit, but also Jacob Murphy deserves a lot of credit for understanding what his role is and embracing that. As Jay said, I think that's really, really good point. He looks, he deserves, I think, as it stands now, he deserves a position. Hypothetically, if Newcastle were to sign Madueke tomorrow, would you start Madueke over Murphy? Let me know in the comments if that's the case. But I think Murphy deserves, regardless of what happens with the right winger this summer, Murphy deserves to start against Southampton. Looks like Miggy is staying. Is that a sideways move? I can't see him improving his output at right winger. Insistence in playing him is beyond me. That's from Hardick Dave. I think, as I said, I've said previously that Eddie Howe is ready to let Miguel Almiron as a first team player. I think that is what he would like. I don't think he'd necessarily like to sell him, because players with that attitude, as I've just explained with Murphy, are invaluable to a team. You need players who put the team first in that sense, and Miguel Almiron works in that sense. But I do think that there's got to be a question asked to Hardick Dave's point about planning for the right wing situation. This has been the only position that's never been strengthened, and they've had opportunities to do it previously with Barnes, and made a different and taken a different path. And it was kind of odd at the time, and I think that's come home to roost a little bit, as good as Barnes is. But they've had an opportunity this summer to do the same thing and haven't. I do think if they don't sign a right winger, there needs to be a question of that. Absolutely, I can't fault Almiron for his application and effort, but he's got zero football IQ. I think that's slightly harsh, but I do sort of take the thought, the sentiment on board. I think he has come to a point where he's not good enough. My issue is I've seen a lot of people on Twitter, and I know it's Twitter, but I've seen a lot of people on Twitter talking about him as if he's the worst player to ever play for Newcastle, or one of the worst. I think you need to go and look back at some of the terrible players that have played for Newcastle, or some of the players who've taken Newcastle for a ride in the past, to really give Miggy his dues when he does leave, or at least when he steps away from being a first team regular. Because I think that's ultimately the issue, isn't it? Is that the idea that Newcastle could go into a fourth season of the takeover, a third full season of the takeover, with Almiron possibly being a first choice right winger, when that isn't when the sort of original bones of the squad isn't that for any other position. And I fully understand that, but I think that he deserves a lot more respect than he gets from some quarters. Jay says, I think they bought Barnes because Gordon didn't show when he first came in, and that's a really good point. We are looking at Barnes from this and the Gordon Barnes situation from now, where Gordon is a superstar for Newcastle and a guaranteed starter. That absolutely wasn't the case. I actually looked back at I think it was my Cellar Cup vlog, or one of the early videos that I did, previews of a game, and I was talking about Barnes and Gordon, and it was very much a toss-up between who starts at the time, and that's hard to really understand now. But you do have to remember, I think that's a really fair point, you do have to remember that Gordon there was a question mark over whether he was going to fulfill his potential, and obviously that he did, and he did at a point where Barnes's reputation stunted because of his injury. But also Barnes came on a lot of games at the end of last season, I think was at Luton and West Ham, and turned games from the bench, which won't have helped his perspective. The idea that he is a little more than a bench player, is an impact player. And I think that's kind of between the things that Jay's just rightly pointed out, and Barnes playing as a right, coming on as a substitute, I think is not really, that's where this sort of ideas come from. But it would be interesting, I think, to see the pair of them play on either side if we're in a position, if Newcastle are in a position to not be able to strengthen at right wing. But I do think there is a question that needs to be asked if he isn't brought in. Let's push through back to a lot of Leicester fans loved him, but always said the same thing: if he isn't banging the goals in, you don't tend to notice him. And I think a lot of Newcastle fans have noticed that this season as well. Jay, I agree with that as a criticism, at least, of Barnes. Craig says, I like Almiron. He's just frustrating as it gets. He has the ability to be amazing, just doesn't look up to making the correct pass. Yeah. Sharia was going mad a few times last season. Yeah, there's a limitation with him, and I'm not sure it's always been the same, hasn't it? I think he's great for the impact that he can have on the team generally. I think we saw that in his first 6 months under Benitez, when he came in that January and transformed. It's hard to make the case that he transformed the team because he didn't score or assist, but he did. He really did. If you remember the Huddersfield game, that debut, that if he scores that chip, if he scores that chip, that chipped opportunity that he has in that Huddersfield game, it could all be very different. But in that first 6 months before he got a hamstring injury towards the end of that season, he was phenomenal and he really changed the team. But he didn't. He still had that sort of like lack of end product, as was evidenced by the fact that he didn't score or assist. And I think as time's gone on, the team has become less reliant on individual impact, and it's become a team. Sort of every player is a cog in a machine, and that's where you've seen Almiron's deficiencies come to the fore a bit because he can't have that sort of impact with his energy as much because he's there to do a job, and his job is as rightly pointed out by a lot of his critics, his job is to score an assist, and he just doesn't do it enough. Yeah, no, Craig's. I think Craig's just made my point. I know it sounds harsh, football IQ, but top players are playing chess on the pitch, and Miggy isn't. I think that's exactly the kind of the point, isn't it? That Almiron is now in a team where he has to have he has a certain job to pick a certain pass, and I think he's got better at it. I think that's why he had that purple patch, and I think his critics talk about that purple patch being just a bolt from the blue where he everything, it was just lucky, but it wasn't. Obviously it was a reflection of what he can do. It was just obviously he was brimming with confidence, and he looks like the kind of guy who needs a lot of confidence, needs people to believe in him, and he isn't getting that. Dave says Tino over Trippier to kickstart the season. Harry Josh Colkin has him in his team. So do I. Yeah, I think now's the time. With all the talk about Trippier going, that sort of died down because West Ham have obviously moved for Wan-Bissaka. But I think, for me, this is a season where Trippier starts to come out of the team. It might not be obvious. It might not be a big moment where there's like a sort of passing of the guard. But there are fewer games, and this is kind of the interesting point. I think that last season, my justification for signing Tino Livramento for 40 million, when again there were other more obvious things you could do with that money at the time to strengthen the first 11 rather than just strengthen a certain position. And then Trippier played all of the games that he up in that first half of the season to the point where he got so tired and so he had that disastrous December, which for me was a massive part of that was fatigue, because he was getting, his legs are going. We can't deny that, and he was playing twice a week. That isn't the case anymore. But I think at this point, Livramento is putting in performances that for me are every bit as good as Trippier is, and the fact that he's younger and more worth investing in that sense means that he should be the man who starts more games. Craig said what I think a lot of people think about Almiron. It's difficult to really go too hard on him because ultimately he just tries so hard. As I said earlier, there have been a lot of players in Newcastle's black and white stripes that have never tried nearly as hard as him. And if you truly want a team that tries and you're not demanding a team that wins, you've got to respect what he brings. Last season, everyone was screaming about needing a number 6 and freeing up Bruno, but with the midfield rammed, we aren't buying one. I think Howe has secretly been moulding into Tonali into a 6. Actually, I think what's happened there, Jay, is that they looked at possibly getting a 6, and then also looked at maybe doing something different with the midfielder. With the midfield generally, and I think Eddie Howe, he's gone on record to say that he was watching the semi-finals of the Champions League the previous season when Milan played against Inter, and Tonali was excellent in one of those games. He said he fell in love with him then, and I think actually what they wanted is a midfield that rotates and has fluidity, and you find a way to get Bruno and Tonali playing together. Ultimately, then if Bruno leaves, I think that was what they were under. I think Newcastle have been in a position, I've said this before, where they've recognised that there could be a possibility of Bruno leaving and bringing in Tonali, who is effectively a very similar player, slightly different skill set in terms of flair versus physicality and flair versus energy maybe and sort of practicality or whatever. But they roughly do the same thing. They win the ball, they control the tempo of games and stuff. If in the worst case scenario, if Bruno goes, then Tonali's in and ready to make an impact on the team. That obviously didn't happen because of his ban, but I think the idea with Bruno and Tonali was to make the midfield, and probably Joe Linton as well, make the midfield rotate a little bit, make the midfield fluid, have Joe Linton, because Joe Linton's shown, I think he played as a 6 at the weekend, and he showed that he could do that as well. So if you got a midfield of 3 8s that have very similar skill set in terms of certain ways, then hopefully one of them is always in the six role rather than a specialist six, if that makes sense. We could walk. I hope you're not telling me to jog on. I think Ian, are you telling Gahey to I think he's telling Gahey to jog on. Yeah, Newcastle could move on from Gahey because he wants superstar money and all that sort of thing. I think that's slightly a little bit harsh on Gahey himself. I think Gahey is doing everything he can without trying to rock the boat to get this move. I think this is Palace playing hardball, and I think that it's now at a point where either they make the final move and get him, or they don't make a move and move on from him completely. But Gahey is no Isak, and I fully understand the sentiment behind that. I think when Newcastle signed Isak, it was a signing that took him to a new level. I think Gahey can be that in a centre back sense, but I've said before, I think Newcastle should definitely have gone for a cheaper centre back and gone for a more expensive winger, as opposed to going all in for a centre back and then actually be in a position where it's not obvious whether they can strike a deal for a winger. I still think Madueke on a loan to buy option could be something later in the window, with Chelsea now ramping up the decision to get rid of a few players. By the sounds of it, Madueke is on that list, but Maresca is known to be a big bit of a fan of his as well, so that'll be interesting. If I was to mould one of our midfielders into a six, it would be Joe Linton. Guy's a beast. This is Craig, by the way. He has pace and power to bully opponents. Absolutely, I think, but that's the point. They can all do. Bruno we've seen as a six. Tonali has played as a six. He's a bit sort of like, lots of people think he's very similar to Pirlo. He sort of characterizes himself more like Gattuso, who's like he was a very tenacious eight, but kind of more, and towards the end of his career played in the six role. So I think what my point is between those three of them, once they get their understanding, which, as I say, was coming through with Tonali and coming through with with Bruno towards the end of the time that Tonali was playing before his ban. Once you get that understanding, all three of them can do the job at a different point, almost like Rush number 6, if you like. If you ever played football as a kid with Rush goalkeeper, kind of the same principle. Like whoever's closest does the 6 role, but there's always somebody in the role, but they all sort of move around together. A few more comments. Are you confident we'll get those 2 players? Says Dave. I think we'll get one. I think Newcastle will get one. I think that's definitely, and that's not me saying that they won't get the second one, but I think that they'll get their defender if that's what they're aiming to do, and then they can look at potentially getting a right midfielder on a deal that's. I think they'll definitely get one. I think that they could get 2, because I think Chelsea, as I said, I think Madueke is a player who he's the only player who's on the list who's been on the list all summer that's now in the price range. So there was the knockabout names of like Gibbs White and Mbumo and Neto, obviously prior to Chelsea, that we spoke about earlier in my Monday shows in like May and June. Those are all high above that price tag. Madueke's name emerged after the Elise collapse, and I think that's when they sort of, maybe I'm speculating, but maybe they looked at that, and that's when they decided to swap the priority round and go big on a centre half and try and get someone like Madueke, who, even if you buy him, he cost Chelsea £30 million, and he's not played that much. He's not progressed. He's not they can't really hope to get a profit. So the max you would probably look to pay is 25, 30 to get him outright. You could do that on a loan with an obligation. I would look at as well. Wages, he's only on 50 grand, so he's a cheap option, but he would definitely make a difference to the team, in my opinion. So I think Elanga is a really good option. It's interesting. Elanga. So Craig just mentioned Elanga's name, and I think Elanga is a really, really interesting situation, because when his name was linked earlier in the summer around the likes of Mbumo and Neto and bigger names, similar to Madueke, I think the fact that he was seen as a little bit of a downgrade, but I think in the context of that, Newcastle were supposed to be going big on a right winger at the time, and he wouldn't have felt like that marquee signing. But if Elanga comes in next to Gahey, I think that's definitely an improvement on what they've got on the right hand side. But I think Madueke for me is more likely. If anyone's going to come in on the right hand side, I would imagine it'd be Madueke at this stage, because their interest is is definitely there for it's been there for a long time, and he's definitely a player that they like. And I think Chelsea, as I say, at the moment, they say, Maresca is a big fan, but Chelsea need to get rid of a lot of players. And I'm actually writing a big article on Chelsea for a weekly column I do at the moment. And I think, they had an opportunity this season to clear up their crisis and clear up their chaos, and they've just added to it. And the fact that Neto's come in has really, really summarised that. I think as much as Madueke has been used quite a bit in pre-season, and by the sounds of it, he's quite keen to stay and fight for his place. I think at the point where Chelsea needs some players out, and if as it was with Hall, they're gonna be more concerned about PSR towards the end of the window than they are now. And I think Newcastle might be in a position to strike for Madueke in a very similar way than they did for Hall. 8 goalkeepers. Who the F needs 8 goalkeepers? Yeah, isn't it interesting that Newcastle are still supposed to be keen on a deal for James Trafford down the line as well? Vlachodimos is a player that again was a deal that was really done out of necessity of a very panicked time. And I think it's really sort of that really put the cat amongst the pigeons in terms of what the 8 goalkeepers situation was. Craig says, I see Elanga like Gordon before we got him, slightly ahead of Gordon, to be fair. That's there's a Howe player in him. Absolutely agree. And I think it's all about perception, as I've just said. I think if he came in as the marquee signing, I think Newcastle fans would have been quite disappointed. If he came in as a slightly cheaper, maybe 30, loan to buy, or loan with an obligation to buy, or sort of £30 million or something like that, alongside Gahey, I think it would be viewed as indeed a very good is a very good option down that right hand side. 41 first team players. What Chelsea thinking? Yeah, I think it's really difficult to. As I said, I think if you look at the money that Chelsea have spent, and you look at what they could have done in the last 2 years and what they've neglected to do, they should have spent the money to be a superpower. They've spent so much money that they could have really put themselves at the top of the football, and they're no better than a mid-table team, and that's down to just no real plan beyond just buying good players with a perceived manager who with a string of managers who are perceived to play good football and work with young players, and sort of just ask that manager to come up with a system that works. And the only example where that's actually somehow works is with Cole Palmer, and that was a player that people actually thought was going to be a really poor signing for Chelsea last season. So I actually think that, but I think that you're right. That 40. I mean, where do you find the right? Where do you even start trying to find your best team when you've got so many first team players? And it was never the case. It was always the case that they had this high level of turnover of players. They loaned a load out. They had these feeder clubs and everything under Abramovich, but they never really gave credence to. It was always about winning immediately. It was immediate gratification, if you like, rather than sort of this idea that they currently have, which is trying to develop all these players for the first team. I mean, you've got the lad from Brazil who's coming in next season, I think, which is on the right hand side, which surely should play into Madueke's perspective as well. It's just crazy what's going on at Chelsea. I think they're in a difficult position, but I think that's why ultimately I think, going back to the very start of the video or the live stream, Newcastle are in a good position because they're a better team than Chelsea. And that's one team. They're a better team. They've got a better identity than Manchester United. That's another one. Villa are sort of similar, but they're going to be they haven't strengthened their team for me, and they're going to be having Champions League football, a bigger group stage as well. So that's going to have even more of an impact on. It's going to run deeper into the season. That's going to be problematic. Unai Emery is not known particularly for prioritizing the league over cups. That's what he's always prioritised, cups over league, and that could have an impact for Villa. Arsenal, Liverpool, I think are still better than Newcastle. They'll still finish above Newcastle, but it's not as they're the team of the top 3 that you can look to catch. So I think there's reason to be optimistic for Newcastle. Yeah. So I think Newcastle. I think let me know in the next 5 minutes before I wrap this up where you think Newcastle will finish. Just one word, one position. Let me know, and we'll get a little straw poll going because I think people are starting to drop out a little bit, and it's coming up to an hour. I tend to keep these live streams at an hour, so let me know what you think. Will Newcastle or just either top four, either a position, or do you think they'll finish top four? Yes or no? And we'll get a straw poll in the next couple of minutes before we go. Above Man United again, and I'll be happy. That was the first time throughout everything. That was the first time Newcastle finished above Manchester United in the Premier League era, and it still wasn't enough to finish in Europe. Top four, yes, says Tiffline. Even without signings, I think again, if you weren't here, Ian, earlier on, we sort of discussed that a little bit. It's not about signing so much; it's about the players coming back and that midfield looking like it used to, and all that. So I think Newcastle are in a position where they can certainly challenge, and definitely look like they can do that. Also, just before I go, I did a channel update. There's going to be a Thursday show tomorrow with a few more rumours and a little bit of a preview of the Southampton game. Hopefully, a live reaction to Southampton on Saturday. I'm taking the week off before I go to Paris for the Paralympics for a couple of weeks in Friday next week. So the YouTube output will quieten down for a couple of weeks, but then I'll be back, and there's lots of new content coming, lots of live content coming. So do subscribe for that and get involved if that's what you like. Lots of people really getting involved. Jason, my wife wants to know the black and white kits. This one here. So there's 3 kits on my wall. I'll explain what they are. That one is a replica shirt from when I was the Newcastle shirt is a replica Shearer shirt from his last season when I was 11 years old. Got signed by Alan Shearer. That is a signed Xavi Hernandez shirt which I bought off a seller on the internet. I was told and have a certificate say it's legitimate, but obviously who knows. And that one, which is the one Jay's asking about, is I played at St James's Park for a charity called Friends of Seydou, it was Papa Cisse's charity. He was where he's from in Senegal, and there was a bunch of lads from Newcastle who played in a friendly game for a couple of years. That's the second time I did it, and I won man of the match in that match in which Rob Lee and John Beresford played, and John Beresford signed, and Rob Lee actually have both signed that shirt. So it's not a real shirt. It's a friendly match that I played at St James's Park against Rob Lee, against John Beresford alongside Rob Lee. I was captain that day, so I captained Rob Lee and played against John Beresford, won man of the match, and got John Beresford's shirt as a reward. Hi, Nikki, how are you doing? So we are looking at wrapping up. So it says Liverpool, new coach, Chelsea, a disaster. Man United still playing Harry Maguire tune, had no Europe, and Eddie is good and getting them ready when he only has one game a week. I think that is a very, very fair point. I think that is why ultimately the pressure is on Newcastle to develop to deliver something this season. I think in terms of going for the Champions League. We won't pay more for Gahey than we did for Isak. That's silly, says Ian. Yeah, possibly. I think that's probably playing on the minds of the club. Certainly, when you get to this level, it's going to impact PSR or something, isn't it? So, and I think the idea of the optics of that maybe aren't great. So I wonder what the next step is. But thanks so much, everyone. Please continue to like, share, and subscribe. I'll be back, as I say, for the Thursday show. Sorry, tomorrow. Do check out the channel update and subscribe. Thanks, Dave. Thank you very much for the good luck message. I will enjoy the Paralympics, but before then, I'll be back for the Thursday show obviously tomorrow, Thursday, and then on Saturday night. Possibly, I'll put a note out, but I'm hoping to be back to react immediately after the Southampton game from here. As I say, it's a little bit of a weekend off before I go, and then there'll be the Monday show and the Thursday show next week, and then a little bit of a quiet time before coming back for September when things will ramp up again. Check out the video with the channel update to see how that will play out. So thank you very much, guys, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.